Well, Mike, we're getting close to the end here on Exodus.
Yeah, well, 28 and 29, I don't know if people are realizing this, but after this one, and we'll do 30 and 31 next time. And it'll be, once you hit 35, chapter 35 through 40 is essentially repetition of the 5 or 6 or 8 chapters that preceded it. So we're actually closer to the end than people might realize.
All right, Mike, I'm ready for Exodus if you are.
All right, Exodus 28 and 29 today. I'm not going to read through the chapters because that would be just really kind of dull. And in the course of doing what we're going to do today, you're going to hear lots, I would say, venture to say even most of the details of the chapters anyway as we go through. But what I want to do is sort of approach the issue of chapter 28 is the garments that the priests were supposed to wear. And then chapter 29 is the ceremony that sanctifies them. So I want to just sort of topically approach both of these chapters in terms of, okay, what can we get out of this? Like what's the biblical theological messaging here? And if you're new to the podcast, this is kind of what we do, not just with chapters like this, but just generally, because you can have just a narrative story. You can have stuff like this, like descriptions of, priest clothing. The last time we were in Exodus, it was like descriptions of the tabernacle and the furniture. And it's easy to just read through that stuff and say, man, I'm glad I'm through that because that's just kind of dull. But what we miss, again, because we're not, living back then, we're not part of that worldview and that environment, that culture, is we miss the theological messaging of what's actually in the content. And so for the podcast, this is what I try to focus on. I'm not going to, drill down into specific phrases, for the most part. We're just going to take a look at the stuff and kind of read it like someone, living back then would, sort of applying an ancient eye to it and what they would have, what impressions, again, theologically, religiously, would they have gotten from this description over the course of these 2 chapters. So with that in mind, I'm going to reference, at least in the first part of this episode, an article by Christoph Nihan and Julia Ryder. It's titled Aaron's Vestments in Exodus 28 and Priestly Leadership. And this is from a book called Debating Authority, Concepts of Leadership in the Pentateuch and the Former Prophets. So that's a biblical scholarship book. It's not like a John Maxwell leadership book, so don't be misled by the title. This is a scholarly work on, the ancient content of the Hebrew Bible and its wider environment. And this particular chapter in the book gets us into the high priest clothing. And in some respects, more generally, the priestly clothing, but we'll focus on the high priest here because there are a number of things about the description of what he wears that are significant, again, theologically, in terms of the religious messaging. So they jump in this way. They're going to reference Menachem Haran, who wrote a very famous book on the temple and the temple service. And so that's how they're going to come out of the gate referencing his work. But then they're going to veer pretty quickly again into some of their own research, more recent. This is a 2018 book, so it's pretty up to date in terms of scholarship. So let's just jump in. They write this. As M. Haran and others have observed the various metals, the various materials used in the fabrication of the tabernacle in the priestly account, that's Exodus 25 through 31, and Exodus 35 through 40, comprise a complex and sophisticated system of classification. Let me just stop there. So we've talked about this before, how there are different gradations of holiness that even are analogous to the gradations of holiness on the mountain itself. So they're referencing that from previous episodes. So they comprise a complex and sophisticated system of classification, which plays a central role in the definition of different grades of sanctity inside the sanctuary itself. The fabrics used, as well as the way in which they are combined with other materials, are integral to this system. The description of the clothes of the high priest in Exodus 28 clearly participates in this logic. But the way in which the fabrics used for these clothes actually index the high priest's agency within the sanctuary has not always been sufficiently recognized. So let me stop there. What they're basically saying is, look, hey, you notice that the tabernacle has these different gradations of holiness zones or whatever. And you notice how those are analogous to Sinai. They're going to say there's things to notice about the high priest's clothing that sort of accomplish the same task, that play into this sort of perspective, this, again, messaging that's in the descriptions of the sanctuary itself. So back to their article, they write, essentially, Exodus 28 differentiates 4 items of clothing that are common to all the priests, namely the tunic, the sash, the headpiece, and the undergarments. That's Exodus 28:39 through 43. And 4 items that are unique to the high priest, the choshen, the ephod, the robe, and the diadem. That's Exodus 28:6 through 38. Now, I want to focus on the unique ones. So we're gonna take a look for the most part the rest of the way on the high priest or at the high priest. So their article continues when they get to that section this way. So the choshen, or the breast piece, is how we would see it translated in the English Bible, is described as a folded cloth forming a square pouch, measuring 1 by 1 span and ornamented with 12 precious stones or semi-precious stones, inside which the Urim and the Thummim were placed. Again, at Exodus 28:15 through 30. The ephod, for its part, designates an item comprising a strip of fabric around the waist and 2 strips of fabric fastened around the shoulders, each of which is also ornamented with a precious stone. Exodus 28:6 through 14. The clothes that all the priests share are made of shesh linen, which presumably designates a superior type of linen. The only exception is the undergarments, which are made of bad linen. The 4 items that are specific to Aaron are also made of shesh linen, but are distinguished by their inclusion of other additional fabrics. The robe of the ephod, as well as the cord which fastens the diadem to the headpiece, are made of techelet, which presumably refers to a sort of bluish or greenish purple, whereas the breastpiece and the ephod are made of techelet argamon, which is another kind of purple, perhaps more reddish, as well as tolaat shani, or crimson. So let me just stop there. So they're saying, look, all the priests, have garments in common, but then there are some elements that are added to what the high priest wears that are different. And you probably already noticed, because of the coloration, some of these terms, that there's going to be an alignment with certain parts of the tabernacle. Again, so this is going to be part of the argument that what the high priest wears is going to be analogous to certain zones in the tabernacle, gradations of holiness. So the article continues this way. The different fabrics used for the high priest and the other priests correspond to the fabrics used for the confection of different parts of the sanctuary. The shesh linen with which the main vestments worn by all the priests, the tunic, the sash, and the headpiece, are made, is already used for the fabrication of the curtains of the outer court. The mixture of blue, purple, and crimson yarns, which distinguishes the confection of the breastpiece from that of the ephod, is also used for the confection of the curtains of the sanctuary, as well as of the 3 veils that delineate the outer court, the outer sanctum, and the inner sanctum. Additionally, the robe of the ephod and the cord of the headpiece are made of bluish purple alone, which is the dye used for the laces holding together curtains of the sanctuary in Exodus 26:4. The same association between Aaron's clothes and the sanctuary is furthered by the designation of the breastpiece and the ephod as ma'aseh choshev, the work of a skilled designer. So let me just stop there. Those things, there isn't a whole lot that's mentioned or described this way, but Aaron's clothes and the sanctuary are described that way. They are the work of a skilled designer. Exodus 28:6 and 15. This is an expression, back to the article, which is otherwise used only to describe the fabrication of the curtains of the sanctuary and its innermost veil. Exodus 26:1 and 31. Additionally, the confection of the breastpiece and the ephod includes a 5th element, namely gold, which apparently refers to golden threads woven into these vestments, as the description in Exodus 39:3 makes clear. The mention of gold has no parallel in the fabrics used for the tabernacle, but closely associates Aaron's clothes with the materials used either for the objects placed inside the sanctuary, such as the ark, the table, again, the bread of the presence, and the luminary or the lampstand, or for the elements that comprise the structure of the sanctuary itself, such as the planks, the columns, and the hooks. These observations suggest that the fabrics involved in the confection of the priestly clothes are part of a comprehensive system which indexes the differentiated roles, status, and agency of the high priest and the priests, whereas the fabrics used for the other priests associate them with the outer court. The materials involved in the confection of Aaron's clothes uniquely associate him with the sanctuary, again, the inner part. The association of the priest and the high priest with different spaces corresponds in turn to their different roles within the cult. Let me just stop there again. The word cult used in biblical studies refers to those who do rituals, just the ritual system. So let me go back to the article again. The association of the priest and high priest with different spaces corresponds in turn to their different roles within the cult. While the priest's main cultic duties comprise the offering of the community sacrifices in the outer court, Aaron assumes unique responsibilities within the sanctuary. The important point here is that the fabrics used for Aaron's vestments do not merely symbolize his privileged access to and unique agency within the sanctuary. In the priestly conception, they literally enable it. While the mixture of various fabrics for the confection of the curtains and the veils of the sanctuary marks off this space as being particularly holy and therefore inaccessible to humans, the donning of such vestments grants Aaron a permanent right of entry within that space. As such, the description of the fabrics in Exodus 28 simultaneously makes human agency possible within the sanctuary, while also restricting this agency to one central agent, the high priest, who is identified by his clothes. Now, let's just stop there for a moment. I mean, think about that. So you have the high priest is clearly distinct. Okay, clearly different, again, corresponding to the most holy place. Again, and we know, again, from Leviticus 16 and some other things, we've talked about, that only he can do certain things at certain times of the year. So, again, it goes beyond, like they say here, it goes beyond symbolizing privileged access and unique agency. These garments literally enable him or equip him, or I don't know another good way of saying it. I guess enable is a good word. They enable, again, his access to these parts. And so everything else is inaccessible. And when you think about, Jesus, let's just go back to the series on Hebrews, Jesus, the role of the high priest. It's not merely, when you look at something like this, it's not merely that Jesus has this unique mediatorial role, which of course he does. But if you're thinking in this mode about the high priest, and you're a Jew reading the book of Hebrews, and you know all this talk about Jesus and the high priest, or after the order of Melchizedek, who was also a king, and we're going to get to that in a moment, because there's something about the garments that relates to royalty. Okay, if you think about it that way, then he's not only the mediator, and his sacrifice is better, and the stuff that the book of Hebrews says more transparently, but if you're in tune with this sort of worldview, what you're also picking up is that he is just sort of unique by definition. That, again, there's only one of those, and there can be only one of those. So it casts just a different light on, again, how the high priest was viewed, and consequently, when you get to the book of Hebrews, how Jesus would have been thought of in a Jewish system, again, in their worldview, how they remembered or thought about. I mean, they're dealing with the second temple, but so it's part memory, it's part, it's still around as an institution in life, but it would have meant a little bit more as far as how, again, just the utter uniqueness of it. And since there's only one in their system, and then you have this guy Jesus come along, and he sort of usurps. Okay, not in an incorrect way, but he actually is the better unique one. Again, he just casts it in a different light. Let's talk a little bit about the ephod. Now, the article by Nihan and Ryder get into the specifics of the clothing as it goes on, and I want to pull out a few things here because the what they say here, I think is and I shouldn't say I think they take a lot of pains in their article to basically make the point that, hey, lots of people have missed this connection, and more recent scholarship has really done more with it. And so I want to pull this out as far as the ephod and see how this sort of combines with kingship. We know the high priest wasn't king. Israel doesn't have a king. I'm of the view that kingship in Israel wasn't disallowed by the Torah. I think there's reasons why the Torah has rules, for kingship. I think that's assumed by God, within the system. But the one thing that's unique about the Israelite king, we'll just take a little rabbit trail here, because we all think of the passage in Samuel where God says to Samuel when the people, want a king, they want to be a king, they want a king to be like the other nations, and that's the crucial thing. You have to ask yourself, in what way? When God tells Samuel, look, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me from being their king. Well, in what way? Because we have these rules in the Torah about, hey, here's what a good king looks like. So you would think this has been anticipated. So why is God torqued? Well, if you actually read the passage in Samuel, there's this phrasing about they want somebody who will go out and come in, again, to be like the other nations. What that means is they want a commander in chief. They want a guy who would lead the army out to battle and then come back in. And the whole point of the Exodus narrative and everything that's gone up, really to the period of the Judges, through the conquest, is that God is the one who fights for Israel. Yes, there's Joshua, but he takes his orders from God. When he doesn't, then everybody pays the price. So God is viewed as the one who fights for Israel. He's the divine warrior. And that's important because when the people say we don't want that, we want we want only this, we want to be like the other nations in this particular way, then that's a big deal. Because if you go back to the rules, for being a good king, that language about going out and coming in and all that kind of stuff, it really is underplayed, or in some cases, some would argue that it's not even there, because God is the warrior who fights for Israel. He's the actual commander in chief. He is the Lord of hosts, is the point. And the hosts under his leadership fights for Israel. So when that's rejected, that's the sticking point in Samuel, not just having a king per se. But again, coming back from the excursus there, the rabbit trail, there are things about the high priest that dip into royal imagery. And that's not, again, to make the priest the king or the king the priest, okay? But you can already see kind of where this is going. If you've listened to the podcast for a while, you're going to know that I take the view, and none of this is unique to me, that the priesthood of Aaron was a concession, that originally there was going to be one leader who would be both king and priest and all that kind of stuff, because that was the pattern before Moses and with Moses. And then, we have this problem with Moses in Exodus 4, and, God says, okay, we'll put Aaron into the picture. So the priesthood is a concession. But even with that concession, there's going to be things about it that dip into the royal imagery. So you've got Adam, you've got Melchizedek, you had Moses, you have these single figures that combine both elements until you get to Moses and Aaron. Then it splits up. Again, you can go back and listen to the episode on Exodus 4 and some of that material just to get the idea. But even with the split up, there are still sort of indicators, and I would say this is theological messaging in the context of what has preceded it in the Hebrew Bible, that there's still royal imagery here. And that's going to become important because later on, you're going to have the Messiah, who is the son of David, and he's not from Levi, but again, according to Psalm 110, and of course the book of Hebrews, he is also a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, who was a king priest. So basically you're going to go back to where the two are fused into one. And if you think about believers as well, another rabbit trail, we are a kingdom of priests, okay? And we also will rule with Jesus. So even us, the two are combined. Moses and Aaron are the anomaly. Again, that's where it gets split into two things. Everywhere else, it's like a fusion. So again, just take that away for what it's worth at this point. But let's go to the Ephod and see what Nihan and Ryder have to say here about this, because this is the part that really takes us into this issue. They write about the precious stones on the ephod, on the breastpiece that's part of the ephod and tied together with the ephod, all that stuff. And the ephod itself had stones on it. Precious stones were not only associated with kings and high-ranking officials in the Western Asian world, but also, by the way, Western Asia would be Middle East in our parlance, or ancient Near East. They were not only associated with kings and high-ranking officials in the Western Asian world, but also, and even primarily, with deities. And this, the two. This is a very recent article, so they actually reference Carmen Imes' book in reference here, but I can't pull that out because it's backed, or I would have read you what Carmen said. But they actually reference Carmen's book in a footnote. So, she's tracking on this too. So we have this thing where precious stones are part of kingship, high-ranking officials, and deities. In particular, they write, the embroidering of stones on ceremonial clothes is reminiscent of the clothes confected for statues of deities. Although in Assyria, this practice was gradually extended to the ceremonial clothes of the kings in the Neo-Assyrian period, it always remained primarily associated with the statues of deities, as A.L. Oppenheim showed in a seminal article back in 1949. The practice of embroidering precious stones on the clothes of deities is well attested in Babylonia during the Neo-Babylonian period, a context which is of particular relevance for P, especially in connection with the kusitu, a garment reserved for goddesses and worn by Ishtar in her sanctuary of Uruk and in other sanctuaries as well. Let me just stop there. Now, P, again, you're familiar with the JEDP, and we talked about this, very recently with the whole issue of the tabernacle construction. Most scholars want to see most of what's going on here as very late, JED and P. P is considered the latest, the last source. And so this is reflected in that quotation there as well. Even if you don't attach chronology to it, basically, we can make the comment that, okay, we've got Assyria, we've got Babylon. There are clear parallels. There are clear, footholds in this description of the ephod with Mesopotamia. Let's just make our language as broad as possible with Mesopotamia, and not only with their kings, but also again with the practice of deities. And again, it's kind of interesting that you get the high priest sort of dressed like a divine figure or a king. Okay, so just hold on to that thought. While it has occasionally been argued on the basis of these parallels that the description of Aaron's clothes with their ornamentations of gold and precious stones would intimate that the high priest is construed as the image of the deity, this suggestion arguably goes too far. Contrary to the divine image in Western Asian cults, the high priest is not the object of rituals and does not receive sacrifices. Nevertheless, the point remains that the bearing of precious or semi-precious stones can index superhuman agency in the Hebrew Bible. Now, I have a few comments about this here. I would say you better believe it's overstated. Let me go back and read this. While it has occasionally been argued on the basis of these parallels that the descriptions of Aaron's clothes with their ornamentations of gold and precious stones would intimate that the high priest is construed as the image of the deity. Well, in P, again, I think we're missing something. Again, if we adopt JEDP and we go back to Genesis 1, who is the image of the deity? That would be everybody. Okay, the image of God idea democratizes the divine image idea. Now, granted, when Israel gets a cult, they get a ritual system of sacrifices and offerings and other services, basically to teach the people about sacred space, sanctify sacred space, and protect sacred space, all that stuff we've talked about, up to this point. Well, then you have to have a subset of individuals that will do what's necessary to purge the sacred space from defilement, protect people from traversing onto sacred space. I mean, you have to be able to teach the concept of sacred space somehow, because you're not all going to live at the mountain. You're not all going to live at the cosmic mountain, Sinai. The tabernacle is a mobile cosmic mountain on the way to Canaan, where it will be reinstalled in a temple, which is designed to be another mountain, Mount Zion, cosmic mountain. And so then the mobile cosmic abode becomes non-mobile. It's supposed to be permanent. So you have to have these things. And even when it's permanent, just as Sinai, there were gradations of holiness. When you go to Mount Zion and you build the temple, you're going to have the same thing, because the tabernacle and the temple are going to imitate, again, these gradations of holiness that were on the mountain. Why? Well, it's designed, again, to teach the people that there is space that is uncommon because God's presence is here. So they're not at the point yet where we are in the New Testament, where believers, individually and collectively, are referred to as the temple of God. We're not there yet. Believers are living stones. What are temples made of? Stones. Okay, I mean, the language in the New Testament is deliberate. Jesus is the cornerstone. The rest of us are the stones of the temple, which is the body of Christ, which is the church, which is us. And again, this is why I think this whole concept, and it's a transparent trajectory. Again, let me riff again, go off on a little excursus here. All the talk about building a new temple in Jerusalem, if you're fixated on that, and lots of theological systems are, namely like a dispensational approach, chances are all of this other stuff is new, and this other stuff is actually in the Bible. To disappoint you, but it's in the Bible. Why do we need a new temple when we've already had the outcome to that? Well, what about Ezekiel 40 and 48? Go back and listen to the 2 episodes of the podcast we did on that. There are significant problems with a viewing that literally, and there's a ton of cool stuff if you don't view it literally that hook into the New Testament. And again, just the wider cosmic theological worldview of the Bible. Okay, I'm not one that's looking for a new temple in a millennium. I don't think you need a temple to have the kingdom of God on earth, have the global Eden. In fact, when we get to the global Eden, there is no temple. Revelation 21 actually says that point blank. There is no temple. I saw no temple there because we don't need one. So again, without drifting off into eschatology, that's not to say that a third temple might get built. It might. I don't think it's part of an end time scenario at all. Doesn't mean that the Jews who want this won't have it. They might get it, might set off a war by doing so. But there you go. I mean, we have lots of other temple language in here. And by the way, if you get a new temple built, that one has to be destroyed too, because in the end, there is no temple. John says that point blank in Revelation. So everybody wants to think about the temple, build a temple, do this, do that, and they don't realize that, well, that has to be destroyed too. Again, there's just a lot of other stuff going on here that, if you're thinking again wider and honestly more cosmically, rather than just sort of what your eyes can see, like in front of you. Oh, I see bricks in a building and mortar, and now I know the temple's real. Well, the cosmic temple is just as real, the whole idea. And to say that if you're not expecting a literal temple, you're not, respecting the Bible. Hey, the church is the temple. Paul says that like 5 or 6 times. And guess what? We exist. Okay, believers are literally in existence. So again, this literalism versus non-literalism false dichotomy is just that. It's false. It's phony. And it really sort of deflects attention away from some really important things. And again, here we go. Now, so we've got the high priest, again, who, is dressed in a certain way in the ancient Near East. Okay, we've got this association with, okay, he's dressed sort of like a deity, the way other cultures would dress a deity, but he's not a deity, he's a human. But yet he's the only one, the single one allowed on this sacred space. Again, the authors of the article are forgetting Genesis 1:26 here somehow, where that passage democratizes this. And so I think that their conclusion is a little off. again, a little either overstated or incomplete is probably a better way to say it. And for that reason, plus another omission they have in the article, I want to get us into a second article. Because this whole thing about democratizing being the image is important. It is a component part of something else in Exodus that, believe it or not, Nihon and Ryder don't mention, and that is the kingdom of priests idea in Exodus 19. So this idea needs in some way to be consistent with or work in tandem with what we've discovered about the way the priests are dressed, and the high priest in particular is dressed, and all this sort of stuff. How that it reflects gradations in sanctity. That's very easy to see because of the materials of the garments that they wear. But when it comes to sort of the messaging of the high priest himself, again, he's not the only image of the deity because of Genesis 1, because of humanity being created as God's image. And he's also, we also can't say he's the only one as well, because Israel's supposed to be a kingdom of priests. And then, of course, those concepts, those wider concepts, fit very nicely into what comes later in the Second Temple period and, of course, in the New Testament. Now, with that in mind, I think what we want to take away from Nihon and Ryder is the matching of the zones of holiness, and again, that what the priest wears is connected to royalty, because there's two other, again, just don't lose the point. In the wider ancient Near Eastern world, who gets dressed like the high priest of Israel does? Well, that would be kings and gods, kings and deities. All right. So we don't want to lose that trajectory, but we want to, again, start working our way toward how this works with the kingdom of priests idea. So one more quotation, I guess, from Nihon and Ryder before we transition here. They write, some elements of the high priest's vestments are effectively reminiscent of royalty. Again, and they've already hinted at that with the kings of Babylon and Assyria. Namely, the diadem placed on Aaron's forehead. Well, that's certainly a royal image. And the association of the koshen, which is the breastpiece, with cosmic order. And other features as well. This is part of their summary. However, this does not mean that this line of analysis can be extended to each and every aspect of Aaron's vestments. That's all true. It's good. But again, their article doesn't really take us into the corporate nature of the priest language, which I think is a significant omission. So for this, I'm going to reference another source, John Davies, specifically John A. Davies, his book called A Royal Priesthood. Just catch the title, Royal Priesthood. Subtitle is Literary and Intertextual Perspectives on an Image of Israel in Exodus 19:6. So the whole book is about Exodus 19:6, and this is far and away the most detailed treatment of Exodus 19:6, which again I will read. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. This is God talking to Moses. So there's a whole book on this. So this is actually a good example of how a monograph, a book on a single subject, goes way, 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 way beyond a commentary, even a good commentary. I mean, this is far and away the most detailed book on this subject that is in print. And for those of you who might be interested in getting it, you're going to have to know some Hebrew, to work through this. Even though he translates most of his terms, but still, you're going to see Hebrew in it. It might feel like an obstacle, but it's still worth getting. It's going to be a pricey academic book, but there you go. You can get it in Logos as well. So if you're interested in this topic, this is the one to get. John A. Davies, A Royal Priesthood. I'm going to read a little bit from his section on the priestly regal vestments. I mean, even the header, regal vestments. I mean, what he's angling for, again, he's going to be doing the same thing that Nihon and Ryder did with linking the priest by virtue of what he wears with royalty. He's going to be doing that, but he's going to take the discussion, in different directions here. So he writes this: the depiction of the priest in his vestments can only be described as regal in character. As with the tabernacle and its furnishings, the priestly vestments have also provided a fruitful area for fertile imaginations. But there are a number of good sober treatments of both the physical descriptions and the significance these descriptions seem designed to convey. And it is not proposed to cover this ground again in any detail. A few instances will suffice to demonstrate that such garments and such materials of which they were made were otherwise associated with royalty, or at least with the wealthy and influential aristocracy, or were restricted to special occasions such as weddings, when a bridegroom may perhaps be a king or priest for a day. And he quotes Isaiah 61:10 there. I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My soul shall exult in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness, as a bridegroom decks himself like a priest with a beautiful headdress, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels. So continuing on in Davies, the breast piece, for example, Exodus 28:15 through 30, appears to reflect those worn by the pharaohs and the Syrian kings who imitated the pharaohs. The turban, I'm going to skip the Hebrew terminology here, but the turban, Exodus 28:4, and also Zechariah 3:5, there's a slight difference in the Hebrew terminology there. But both of those references, Exodus 28:4, Zechariah 3:5, the turban with its attached rosette or diadem was likewise, apart from its use by the priests, restricted to kings or the aristocracy. And he has a string of references here: 2 Samuel 1:10, 2 Kings 11:12, Isaiah 3:23, Isaiah 62:3, so on and so forth, where you get royalty or aristocracy with these same items. Philo understood this diadem as a symbol of vice regency. Okay, Philo, again, is a Second Temple Jewish writer, 1st century BC or thereabouts. He understood this diadem that the high priest wears as a symbol of vice regency, co-rule, co-regency. Okay? Kaufman observes, quote, the priestly diadem and anointing, catch that, the priest wears a crown, a diadem, and he's anointed. Doesn't this sound like kingship here? I mean, it's easy to miss, but when you think about it, it does. The priestly diadem and the anointing are genuine points of contact between the priesthood and the monarchy. But these symbols are not in themselves signs of authority, but of sanctity and importance. Again, that's an important qualification. The overall, this is back to Davies, the overall effect of the accounts of the priestly regalia in Exodus 28 and 29, Exodus 39, Leviticus 8, with their fine materials, their gold and their precious stones, is to provide the reader with a mental image of the glory and honor such clothing represented. More significantly, not only was it in general terms the clothing of royalty, but there is a close correspondence between the priestly clothing and the materials of the sanctuary as they would appear from within, such that the priest was appropriately attired to enter a renewed cosmos and stand in the presence of the divine resident of this cosmic temple. Let me just stop there. We've talked before about how the tabernacle, again, is mobile sacred space. It is a mobile cosmic mountain. It is a mobile cosmic garden. Okay, the decorations within go right back to Eden. And we've spent a good bit of time in this series here on Exodus about these ideas and how they are conveyed. So I'm going to read that sentence again. More significantly, not only was it in general terms the clothing of royalty, but there is a close correspondence between the priestly clothing and the materials of the sanctuary as they would appear from inside, from within, such that the priest was appropriately attired to enter a renewed cosmos and stand in the presence of the divine resident of this cosmic temple. This is where you get the idea. I mean, you can read this kind of thing in Second Temple Jewish writers about how when the veil tears, it's a tear in the fabric of the cosmos, and you think, well, that's just kind of a funky, flaky, what? It's just a, it's a wooden structure. It's a shack, with some hairy garments over it. No, it's designed to be sort of the microcosm of the macrocosm. Okay, it's a cosmic thing. It's a deliberate small mimicking of the place where God really lives, which is the cosmos. Okay. So the cosmos comes to Earth in this little square, rectangular, building. Okay, this is the idea that they're trying to convey. not only in Israel, but every system's every system's sort of working with the same set of ideas. And, maybe it's easier if you're really into Egyptian stuff. You can see it with Egyptian temples a little bit, better. But the same thing's going on in Israel. I mean, it's intentional. It's deliberate. It's a mimicking of the cosmic garden mountain. That's what the tabernacle and the temple, is. And of course, the Mount Sinai and how that is analogous to the zones in the tabernacle. All that stuff. It's all part of a matrix of ideas. So back to Davies, he says. He's going to talk about the vocabulary of the place now. And again, some of the garments too. The terms kavod, glory, and tiferet, honor, which form an inclusio around the account of the vestments in Exodus 28. So Exodus 28:2 and Exodus 40 have these terms in the beginning and the end, okay? It bookends the chapter. These terms are both also used of the glory theophany of Yahweh himself in Exodus 24:16 and 17, and of course elsewhere, Isaiah 4:5, Psalm 57:5 in English, so on and so forth. So again, let me just think about that. We have terms used in Exodus 28 of the priestly garments at the beginning and at the end, again, bookending the chapter, that are also used of the presence of God himself, the theophany of Yahweh himself. Continuing with Davies. When the high priest entered the most holy place, that is the throne room of Yahweh, he was dressed differently from when he ministered daily in the holy place. For this most intimate of encounters with God, the high priest wore garments of bad linen, Leviticus 16:4, which according to, again, he's going to quote a rabbinic source, the Yoma, 3:6, were white in color. The plain linen seems to mark a degree of holiness greater even than the royal finery of the regular clothing. Let me just stop there. That's essentially what Nihan and Ryder were pointing out, that there are differences here. Back to Davies. The Egyptian priesthood also considered linen garments to be particularly sacred. Genesis 41:42, 2 Samuel 6:14. Linen garments or white garments are the characteristic attire of angels, the heavenly counterparts to earthly priests, when they make their appearances as divine envoys, and when they are pictured as attending upon the heavenly throne. Ezekiel 9:2-3, verse 11, Ezekiel 10:2, Daniel 10:5, Daniel 12:6-7, First Enoch, he has a string of references there, Revelation 15:6, so on. Haran writes of the high priestly linen garments, quote, "These garments serve to indicate a kind of dialectical elevation into that sphere which is beyond even the material. Contagious holiness characterizing the tabernacle and its accessories," unquote. Roland Deveau writes, quote, "The priest, therefore, had quitted the profane world and entered into a sacred realm," unquote. The Enochic literature depicts the angelic watchers as heavenly priests. First Enoch 14:22-23. And the identification of priests as otherworldly is in fact widespread in Second Temple Judaism. The Jewish group responsible for some liturgical texts found at Qumran shared the viewpoint that angels and earthly priests have closely corresponding roles. Let me just stop there. All of that should be familiar to this audience. Again, we've covered topics where I mentioned the angelic priesthood idea at Qumran. The people at Qumran, who left the temple in the early century, century or two BC, they split from the Pharisees and the Sadducees and everybody else because of the calendar. We think, what a bunch of nuts. Who cares? It's one. It's a serviceable calendar. Why do you care so much? The people at Qumran, whoever they were, again, the best guess is the Essenes. They go out in the middle of the desert to live. Well, that's not actually completely why they did this, because what they do, again, just to do this as briefly as possible, is the people at Qumran held to a 364-day calendar. And again, they knew it was different than the astronomical calendar, which is 365 and a quarter days. Okay, they knew that. They didn't care. Okay, God's calendar is 364. They actually blamed the watchers in their transgression of heaven and earth with screwing up the calendar and throwing things out of whack so that the astronomical year is now 365 and a quarter. Anyway, 364 is God's calendar, 4 quadrants of 90 days with 1 day in between each. You get 364. If you start the calendar on day 4, which is when the sun, is created and back in Genesis and blah, 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 that means that all the Sabbaths every year will fall on the same day. All the festivals of the priestly calendar, same day every year. I mean, everything is in sync. It is mathematically perfect. It requires no adjustment. They thought it reflected the mind of God because it was perfect. Every year, nothing changes. It's unchangeable. It's immutable. And they would mock, or they would criticize the Pharisees and whoever else is doing the service in the actual temple. Every now and then you got to throw in a 13th month there to make the thing realign. You got to figure this out so you can figure out Passover, and you got to do math, and you got to roll dice. They would poke fun at this and criticize it, and basically say, you have a human calendar, we have a divine one. And they actually split over there. So they went out in the desert and pretended to have a temple. And they followed every ritual that was supposed to be performed in the temple out in the desert by themselves. Why? Because they believed they, as the earthly holy ones, were responsible for keeping heaven and earth connected ritually. Like the cosmos is going to come burning down if they don't do this. That's how serious they took it. And what I just read from Davies here is, you will find, he's right. This paragraph is correct. I mean, you will find this stuff in the Second Temple literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, that this is called in academia the idea of the angelic priesthood on earth, the earthly angelic priesthood. These things were to be kept in sync, as in heaven, so on earth. And they really believed that they were the earthly counterparts of what was going on in heaven, which is why they cared about us, measuring time. And again, they look up in the skies, and they're like, well, they're those divine beings who are still loyal to God, who are not falling stars. Okay, what's going on up there is we need to be in sync with that, and so on and so forth, and they're going to use what they see as well to align with the mathematical calendar, but not the astronomical one, because that it got thrown out of whack because of the Watchers and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a whole set of ideas here that just are kind of mind blowing, actually, and mind numbing in the level of detail that it can take you in. But again, to focus here on Exodus 28 and 29, this is what Davies is saying here, is that this is how they viewed the tabernacle, and the way that the high priest is dressed when he's in there, different from the earthly priest, and even on this one day of the year, it's a little bit different. Again, this is why they do it. This is the thought that goes behind it. The holy place, and the most holy place especially, was like entering a different cosmic realm. Now, please don't misquote me and say Mike thinks there was a portal, to another dimension in the Holy of Holies. I don't. That's ridiculous. It's nonsense. We're talking about, again, theological concepts here. How the notion that the two are connected, but we're not talking about, hey, do I have the right jumpsuit on so I don't get burned up when we're not talking about a Stargate here. We're not talking about that. So, having said that, the idea of the connection is still important, and it's reflected in the way the priests get dressed, what they're thinking about with their roles, and so on and so forth. Now, Davies goes on from this, and he writes this. The central concern of this work, his book, is with the expression kingdom of priests contained in Exodus 19:6. As noted earlier, in his book, it is part of a divine declaration which spells out what it means for Israel as distinct from the other nations to be God's special treasure. Of the categorizations of the realistic options for the meaning of kingdom of priests, the list put forward by Scott may be taken as representative. And there's 5 options. What does kingdom of priests mean? Here are the 5 options. It means a kingdom composed of priests, by which Scott understands those who individually have access to God, as may be implied by the New Testament. Okay, a kingdom composed of priests. Number 2, a kingdom possessing a legitimate priesthood. 3, a kingdom with a collective priestly responsibility on behalf of all the people. 4, a kingdom ruled by priests. Or 5, a kingdom set apart and possessing collectively, alone among all peoples, the right to approach the altar of Yahweh, who is the true God. Now, again, he has a lot to say about all of these options in his book. Now, he's going to land on number 5, and of course, number one and number 5, are kind of transparently. I mean, you've got there's a lot of biblical theology hanging, in both of those. But again, just to stick with the content of the book as it pertains to these 2 chapters we're talking about, Davies writes elsewhere, he says, though it has been largely and inexplicably overlooked, an answer lies ready to hand in the accounts of royal or divine grant of kingly authority, such as are found in numerous ancient Near Eastern texts, including the Bible. So what that sentence is saying is, look, how do we balance this idea of priestly authority, kingly authority? You've got 2 separate offices in Israel, but then you've got this statement that Israel itself collectively is a kingdom of priests. How does all this work together? And what he's going to do, I'll just cut to the chase here. What he's going to do is say, look, all of the authority is granted by a single king, who is Yahweh, to people. So the authority is derivative. And you actually, again, have number 5 working here, because only Israel is allowed to approach the true God. Only Israel, again, is in this position. Only Israel has been granted this privilege, granted the authority that comes with it on earth, granted the role of mediation that's implied in Kingdom of Priests to the other nations. Only Israel fits all those characterizations. And so he's saying, look, if we look to the analogy of ancient Near Eastern royal grant treaties, which we have talked about before on this podcast, he says that's the way all these ideas come together. Back to Davies, he says, in such texts, these treaty texts, either the great king or the god grants the office of kingship to a specific mortal king or lesser deity, who then exercises his rule under the aegis and protection of the deity or monarch. Israel, on this analogy, would be a corporate monarch, enjoying the grant of this status and the patronage of Yahweh. We may tentatively conclude that there are good reasons to take kingdom of priests to mean a collective royal company consisting of priests. Let me read that sentence again. We may tentatively conclude that there are good reasons to take kingdom of priests, that's Exodus 19:6, that phrase, to mean a collective royal company consisting of priests. So there you combine both elements. Israel is designated as royal by one who supremely holds the position of Israel's king. That would be God. It is the people of God as a whole who bear this royal dignity and honor. Individuals enjoy these privileges only insofar as they belong to the group. Now let me just stop there. This is why, again, it's not just enough for Israel to be described as royal, the son of God collectively, or just this filiative language. Okay, son of God. Like, this is how God refers to Israel in Exodus when Moses and Aaron are before Pharaoh. Let my son go out into the desert to worship me. Hosea 11, out of Egypt I have called my son. Okay, but that's not sufficient. Israel also has to be not just royalty, royal sons and daughters, as it were, but they have to be priests. Why? Because initially, the image of God status was conferred to all humans. There was no Israel in the beginning. Israel arose out of the circumstances of specifically the last, but really all 3 supernatural human rebellions that we get in Genesis 1 through 11. Israel is the kickstarting of an Edenic vision. And so the king, God, kickstarts Israel to be his son, his child, collectively, through Abraham, supernatural assistance to do that. And therefore, it is sort of Adam and Eve. It's the original plan, the original vision in kernel form. It's like an acorn, okay? It's going to grow into something else. But for God to be faithful to his original vision, where he made all humans part of his family. This new rendition of it has to also serve as mediators to everybody else. That's why they are a royal kingdom. Yes, kingdom, the word kingdom implies royalty. But they're also priests. And so when you get Aaron, who is the chief representative, of the Israelite religious system, for sure he's a priest because he's doing this stuff on our behalf with God. We're learning about sacred space and all that kind of stuff. But the way he's dressed also conveys royalty. Again, in this one guy, he's sort of the microcosm of the bigger idea. He's the chief, now catch this, he's the chief representative of what God really wants. God wants a huge family where everybody is royal and everybody has access to his presence. Everybody plays that part of the priestly role, access part. And doesn't it make sense? Isn't it required that the Messiah, who is the King of Israel, also has to, again, play a high priestly role? He has to fit into this mold. And when we get that with Jesus, lo and behold, the Gospels start to talk about Jesus' body as the temple. And after the resurrection, the body of Christ is collectively the children of God, the church. I mean, all of these concepts interlock. Again, these are threads of biblical theology that, again, you have to start to see them. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. You're going to be able to see how ideas connect to each other, how things interlock and intertwine. And it is not an accident. So even in the way that the high priest is dressed, it's supposed to make you think of royalty and priesthood combined, because that's going to play a role in how we view, the Messiah and how we view Jesus and what the writer of Hebrews and other New Testament writers are saying. I mean, it looks goofy sometimes what they're saying in the New Testament. The reason it looks goofy is because we don't have the rest of this in our heads. They're not just making it up at that point either when they're writing New Testament books. They're playing familiar threads. They're putting they're adding their own material again to the thread, to the tapestry. Again, if I can use that metaphor, to what has preceded. They're not innovating. They're being consistent. They're adding to, they're complementing. They're not innovating. So again, the point of what Davies, was saying is, look, all of this is consistent. All of it's necessary. The priesthood is a microcosm of the macrocosm. Israel's corporate role to the nations as the priesthood mediated between Yahweh and his human family within Israel. That family, the group, mediated between God and the nations. Again, this is the important point. Now, as far as the ritual itself, we're getting a little long here, so I'm only going to give you like one point about the ritual, which I think is kind of interesting. In Exodus 29, Sarna in his commentary about verse 13. I'm going to read you Exodus 29:13, and then we will call it. We'll call it an episode because we're getting a little bit long here. And again, there's just lots of stuff to talk about and think about. But in the ceremony, of course, you have a sacrifice, and then there's instructions on what to do with the blood and parts of the sacrifice and whatnot. In verse 13, we read this: "You shall take all the fat that covers the entrails, of the sacrificed animal, and the long lobe of the liver, and the 2 kidneys with the fat that is on them, and burn them on the altar." You say, well, that's kind of gross, big deal. All right. Well, what's interesting about this is what Sarna has here. And again, if some of you might be familiar with this idea, because we've probably mentioned it a little bit in Leviticus, but here we go again. The Hebrew, translated essentially the lobe of the liver, the protuberance of the liver, literally means the redundance of or upon the liver. In Mishnah Talmud 4:3, the same is called the finger of the liver. And without doubt, the reference is to the lobus caudatus. The requirement to remove and burn this part is quite likely a reaction against the great importance attached to the liver, and of course this part, in ancient Near Eastern divination, a reference to which appears in Ezekiel 21:26. Numerous clay models of the liver have been recovered or uncovered in Mesopotamia, some divided into 50 sections and inscribed with omens and magical formulas for the use of diviners. And that's the end of the Sarna quote. Now, I think it's really interesting. You realize what the gesture means. So here we have the priesthood being sanctified and set apart. These are the people who have access to God, intimately in Israel. The high priest, in particular, is wearing the breastplate, the Urim and the Thummim. And again, for information about the Urim and the Thummim, we're not going to have a separate episode on that. You go to episode 72. That's when we talked about Urim and the Thummim in Leviticus 8 and 9. But here you have this guy. He's got the Ephod. He's got the Urim and the Thummim. He's got the means of access and divination to the true God. And so what does God tell the people to do with the sacrifice, the blood of which is used to sanctify the high priest? He says, that liver thing that everybody else uses to get information from their gods, or they think they do in divination, burn it. Just burn it. Again, it's a real slap in the face of the typical method, a really ubiquitous method of divination in the ancient world. Liver reading, reading entrails and stuff like that. You just burn it. Burn that stuff on the altar. In other words, not only doesn't do any good, but I want this gesture to be a reminder that this isn't how we give you information. I don't want you to do anything that solicits some other deity. You don't need it. Just burn it. You want to know what I think? I'll tell you. It's either going to be, through the leadership, the quote kingly figure, Moses here, or the priest. Again, God gives information through both modes. Again, these two things are supposed to be one, and they're going to be reunited anyway. But I just thought it was kind of interesting, again, to point out God says, yeah, that liver thing, burn it. It's just make it toast, because that's essentially what it is. Again, there's a lot of things we could talk about here, and it would just kind of go on and on and on. But I think, covering it this way, Exodus 28 and 29, the way that the priests are dressed, again, this is the takeaway here is theological messaging. I mean, it's significant because we have seen these things before, especially in the series on Hebrews when we talked about Melchizedek. I mean, we went 4 or 5 episodes on Melchizedek, and earlier about the priesthood of Aaron being a concession and the pattern, and really these two things being fused into one. Even the priest, even the way he's dressed, is consistent with the way ultimately things are going to be. It's the way they were. It's the way things are going to be, both royalty and priesthood, and it even is reflected in the corporate people of God. They are both royal, and they, again, are a kingdom of priests. And it matters. I mean, it's a theological component related back to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, that when you can sort of look at the big picture, the stuff just makes sense. There's a system here. There's a worldview system. I keep using the phrase matrix of ideas, and it's even operative within, again, something as transparently, I guess, boring as what in the world these guys wear. So again, hopefully this is a good way of getting the communicative point across.
And again, Mike, to get more information about what the priest wore, I think it was in the Bible episode 72, 75, somewhere in there, first part of Leviticus.
Yeah, it was 72, Leviticus 8 and 9. You can go back and listen, or you could get the transcript too. We went on a rabbit trail on what the Urim and the Thummim were, so we don't really need to do that here since it already exists.
Yeah, it's nice now to cover so much material. You can just reference it back and say, go listen to that.
Yeah.
Saves us an episode. Well, that's good. All right, Mike. Well, we appreciate it.